Appreciate the overview, and we'll move on to talk by Mike Tuts.
Okay, I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, so let me start. So what I will intend to do is to try and walk you through some of the ESG recommendations for the European Strategy for Particle Physics. This is the 2026 update. One of the reasons perhaps that I'm asked to give this talk was that I was one of the two representatives from the US on the ESG uh, um, European Strategy Group. So let me start. Uh, get you to go up. Oops, sorry. So let me just, in terms of background and context, just remind you a little bit what the remit was for this ESG group. The aim was for the strategy update should develop a visionary and concrete plan that greatly advances human knowledge and fundamental physics through the realization of the next flagship project at CERN. And the plan should attract and value international collaboration, should also allow Europe to continue to play a leading role in the field. And that process has been going on. I just focus on the yellow piece over here, which is the 2026 update, which is what we're talking about here. And what they asked for was the recommendations on the next flagship project for CERN, the preferred collider option, and possible prioritized alternatives and areas of priority for exploration complementary to colliders. And the Venice meeting that occurred in June of this year was the equivalent of the U.S. SNOMES process to get that community input. And also, as mandated by the CERN Council, they wanted to hear about the status of the implementation of the 2020 strategy update, recent accomplishments, and of course, international landscape of the field. You probably have seen this before, which is the timeline for the strategy update. I would just pick a couple of points over here. There were deadlines for submissions from the community, submissions from national input, to leading to this open symposium that occurred in Venice in late June of this year. Then there was gathering all this information. There was the PPG, and they produced a briefing book, which was to be delivered then to the ESG group that would use that as part of their input in forming recommendations. In addition, there was another deadline in mid-November for submission from national input based on some more information. So in fact, one of the working groups, ESG Working Group 2A, carried out an assessment of large-scale accelerator projects, and you saw a table from that Tor showed you over there. And this was then this came out at the end of October, and then by mid-November, the final input was given. At that point, all this information, the briefing document, the working group reports, as they were at the time, were input to what's called the ESG strategy drafting session that occurred at the beginning of December over a 5-day period. And the output of that, and I'll mention that a little bit in the next slide, was the recommendations by the ESG, which was then released by the CERN Council. There are a couple of future elements which are important to getting to ultimately where one wants to go, which is the submission of additional documents supporting these recommendations that you see over here. The recommendation document was only a brief one. And ultimately, the goal, as you've heard over here, is that there will be a couple of council sessions, one in March, where they will now have all of the documentation and the backup documentation to deliberate. And then on the end of May timescale, they meet, I think, I forgot now where they meet, but that one presumably is for updating the ESP documentation itself, actually agreeing on what the European strategy is. And then, as you've heard on sort of the 2027, 2028 timescale, the idea would be that there would be project approval. So let me just go through some of the documents and so that also you can see where they are. So there are input documents, as I mentioned, the briefing book over here. It's large. It's some, well, 250 pages of real substance, but large by the time everything is added to it. That's available on the archive. This then was the input to one of the working groups of the ESG, the working group 2B, to assess the overall physics potential across the various projects that had been submitted. So to evaluate and compare those. That document isn't yet available, so that will appear, as I'll indicate in a moment, later on in January. If you want some sort of recent highlights and previews of that without reading the whole document, I noticed that there's an ECFA meeting that has some nice summaries from various people, so you can look at those if you wish. The one working group document 2A that was released was this assessment of the large-scale accelerator projects. That was looking into the technical feasibility, the required R&D, risks, timeline costs, human resources, and environmental impact. And again, you can see some of these documents over here, and I think these are live, so you can click on them if you want to look further. I mentioned then by mid-November, there was the final input um, into the ESG process from national HEP communities. The takeaway from that is that it was essentially overwhelming support for the FCC EE. So the output now comes from the ESG. That was the recommendation document. It's relatively short, 16 pages or so. I'll talk somewhat, go through some of that here. It's a summary of high-level recommendations. There's some 36 recommendations. Put it in quote because some look a little bit more like statements than actual recommendations. And that's the result of this 5-day drafting session that occurred in early December. The following week after that, it was presented to the CERN Scientific Policy Committee, the SPC, and the CERN Council at the end of that same week. And then it was released by the CERN Council as the recommendations of the ESG to the Council on, I think, December 12th. What's coming in the future is on a timescale of the end of January of 2026. There is something that's called a deliberation document, and that provides more detailed explanations to justify the recommendations that currently are out and that many of you have seen then. With that same deliberation document, there is also all of the working groups. There were 7 working groups, and all of the working group reports will also be available and polished and so on by that time. By the end of January is the time. And so that will be released as accompanying documents as well. And once all of these documents are done, this is the input to the council for them to make their deliberations. So let me get started with going through them. And what I'll show you is the following, that if you see stuff in italics, that's literally the language that is the actual recommendation. Recommendations like these get scrutinized very carefully. So I wanted to try and be careful to make sure that it was the precise language that was being used. And you'll see highlighted in yellow are the places where I was going to try and emphasize those recommendations where they have sort of international aspects or impact on U.S. activities that would be relevant to the U.S. So let me start going through those, and I will read them just to make sure I don't miss a word. The other thing is that you'll see there are different sections in the recommendation document. So I've numbered the section here, and then within a section there are labeled A, B, C, etc. are the recommendations. So starting at the beginning, 2A, it says the full exploitation of the physics potential of the LHC and the HLLHC and the completion of the high luminosity upgrade remain the highest priorities for European particle physics. Every effort must be made to complete the HLLHC upgrade within the current schedule. So again, the highest priority, this we've heard also on the US side. Recommendation 2C. The implementation of the strategy should be pursued in strong collaboration with global partners and neighboring fields. And again, a recognition that our field is truly global, as are these very large projects. And again, as I say, I will leave the other recommendations there, but I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to go through all of those. The input to Working Group 2A, I mentioned, was the submissions for these large projects. You can see over here, along the columns over here, are those large projects. And I've taken Table 1 from this Working Group 2A document, which has some of the basic parameters for the various large projects that were submitted. The one in yellow over here, no surprise, is the one that is the preferred option. And so I've just highlighted in yellow. And just to give you some of the very few basics, 91-kilometer circular tunnel, 4 interaction regions, about 15 billion Swiss francs total, and the various energies that you see that it would run at. Then again, you have now the main, in some sense, the main recommendation, which was the electron-positron future collider, or future circular collider, FCCEE, is recommended as the preferred option for the next flagship collider at CERN. You see a cartoon of that, a picture of that on the right over here, reminding you of the energy range from 91 to 365 GeV, the cost around 15 billion Swiss francs, and a sort of timeline here that you might expect to see, which is approval was anticipated either on the 2027 or 2028 timeline. A construction start around 2033, the end of the HLLHC operations in 2041, and then 5 to say 7 years later, here 5 years, 2046, the start of FCCEE operation ramp up. And then the end of the program in around 2063. There are 3 key elements that went into this decision. Obviously, the physics is one of the key points over there. That comes from the briefing book. And as I mentioned, the Working Group 2A is making the evaluation of comparing the various physics capabilities from the various projects that were submitted. What the statement that appears then in the recommendation document, this brief document, without all the details, but that will come when you see the Working Group 2A documentation, that is summarized as outstanding discovery potential through the Higgs, electroweak, flavor, and top quark sectors, as well as advances in QCD. Of course, the other critical element is the actual accelerator project, and that means the technical feasibility of that. There, the working group has published that working group documentation. I'll mention a little bit of that on the next slide. And again, in summary, technical feasibility is demonstrated by the comprehensive FCC feasibility study. Its scope and cost were well defined. Plausible funding scenarios have been developed, and its schedule enables first beams within 5 to 7 years after the end of the HLLHC operations. And you heard in a little bit more detail from Tor about this. And finally, that it offers a path to the highest energy, that the FCCEE would also pave the way towards a hadron collider, reusing the tunnel and much of the infrastructure, providing direct discovery reach well beyond the 10 TeV Parton energy scale, in line with the community's ambition for exploration at the highest achievable energy. Then there was the question of the preferred alternative option. And so that's recommendation 3B. And it is a descoped FCCEE is the preferred alternative option for the next flagship collider at CERN. Here's the same table that you saw from Tor. And the sort of key findings are captured in this stoplight table over here. There's much more detail provided in the Working Group 2A document, which you can certainly look at and see. But over here, you see, for example, the FCCEE, not surprisingly, is green on all these fronts that you see here. I've listed the table over here. What you should take away from this is that it's how ready you are. So, for example, the scope is how well defined is it? For the TRL that you see over here, this is the technical readiness level score. The R&D is how well defined, again, the R&D plan is and what the status for the funding is. Test facilities include the need for test facilities or demonstrators and the level of definition, again, on their scope, performance, the uncertainty on that, the site preparation status, the schedule, uncertainty on that, the cost, uncertainty on that, and the risk, the level of definition of how well defined those risks are. And you see at the bottom over here is the muon collider. They're red, not meaning that, simply meaning that it's not in the same state as these other projects over here. That, of course, it's a descoping and therefore it'll impact the breadth of the program, but still leaves a very strong physics program with a viable path to high energies. And the descoping would correspond to about a 15% reduction in cost, and Tor talked about that. So there are these three elements to it, which he mentioned. And as he said, if additional resources become available, these descoping options would be reversible. So what about the alternative options? And as he mentioned, they're not ranked. And the reason for that was that unless you know why it is that the preferred option is not viable, the FCC would not be feasible, then you don't know how to rank these other potential options. So I just mentioned, again, based on the recommendation document, for the linear colliders, for CLIC and for LCF, which are operating at two energies up to 550 GeV, there were some pluses and minuses listed over there. On the plus side, the competitive programs in Higgs and top quark physics, then noting that compared to circular colliders, they have significantly lower luminosities at lower energies, leading to limited precision in electroweak physics and non-competitive flavor physics programs. Both colliders require a tunnel up to around a third of the length of the FCC, around 33 kilometers or so, to reach their ultimate energies of 1.5 TeV and 550, respectively, for CLIC and LCF. They noted then the path for 10 TeV collisions would require plasma wake field acceleration, which is not yet proven to be a viable technology. Then specifically for CLIC, they noted would initially operate at 380 GeV. The construction cost of the 550 GeV collider is estimated to be about 60% of the cost of FCC-EE, whereas the full cost of the 1.5 TeV collider would be about the same level of FCC-EE. And for LCF, it would initially operate at 250 GeV, extended up to 550 GeV, and the construction cost of the 550 would be at the same level of that of FCC-EE. And then they noted that the LCF technology is mature. There were other options, LEP3 and LHEC, which are colliders that would reuse the tunnel, offering intermediate physics programs at significantly lower cost. However, neither on their own, standing alone, would be a flagship collider. So to provide that long-term physics program, the vision part, they would need to be complemented by an energy frontier machine such as a hadron collider. And so for LEP3, an electron-positron collider operating up to 230 GeV, it'd offer improvements in Higgs physics with respect to the HL-LHC, strong electroweak and flavor physics programs, but no top quark run. For LHC-EC, an electron-proton collider would combine an energy recovery linear accelerator with LHC, electron acceleration, with LHC, and would offer a strong QCD program and significantly extended knowledge of proton structure. Although it would also offer some improvements in Higgs physics with respect to the HL-LHC, its overall precision physics program is limited. In other research directions over here, here are recommendations there. And so I've highlighted 4A and 4B. 4A is European contributions to both accelerator-based and non-accelerator neutrino and dark matter experiments are essential and should be supported. And then we've heard from a number of presentations over the last couple of days about the neutrino platform. And there's a recommendation there that CERN should continue to provide support to the global long-based neutrino program via the neutrino platform. The collaboration between CERN and non-accelerator-based experiments on technologies of mutual benefit should be continued. Then there was a section on theory. The 5A is a very just strong support recommendation. I just note that, as they said, that in the coming decades, the theory will be marked by the HLLHC program and the beginning of a new flagship facility at CERN. So the success of these endeavors crucially depends on achieving theoretical predictions at an unprecedented level of precision, relies on close interaction and collider phenomenology between theory and experiment, and collaborative efforts in perturbative quantum field theory and lattice QCD calculations, along with developments of theoretical tools for experimental analyses, will be essential. I just note that Jeremy, in his slide 7 on the Genesis mission, indicated a lattice QCD partner. So that leads to a recommendation on collaborative efforts to improve the precision of theoretical predictions should be recognized and supported. Then there were a bunch of recommendations on technologies. This was one general one over here, which was again noting that science and technology underpin the areas of accelerators, detectors, and computing and related infrastructures to provide the foundation to address the key questions in particle physics. So these are deeply embedded in the international particle physics community and essential. The corresponding recommendation, where I've highlighted in yellow, R&D in collaboration with international partners and industry must continue to be supported at high priority. Sorry. On further technologies, in this case, talking about accelerator science and technology, I note in this Tor talked about, this recommendation 6B is the highest priority must be the development industrialization of key technologies, advanced superconducting and normal conducting RF structures, efficient RF power sources, and accelerator quality magnets in the 14 to 20 Tesla range, including those based on high temperature superconductors. Then in the longer term development in recommendation 6D of advanced technologies, things like Wakefield acceleration and bright muon beams, I note the one sentence that comes at the end of this recommendation, which is synergies with the U.S. initiative on muon collider R&D should be exploited. On detector development, and again, Tor talked about the U.S. component of this. Obviously, this detector R&D is essential, as indicated over here, and I go straight to the recommendation 6E. It says for DRD are these detector R&D collaborations. For the DRD collaborations to address the requirements of future flagship projects, they must receive adequate funding. And I note a comment by a presentation by Srini at this last ECFA in November, and I think Tor mentioned this as well, that U.S. is actively engaged in DRDs through a U.S. DRD agreements that are yet to be formalized, but discussions are ongoing. There was on computing, there were a couple of recommendations. I just highlight a couple of them over here. So the planning of future projects that include software and computing from the outset, addressing energy efficiency and sustainability. And then in recommendation 6J, a roadmap coordinated among CERN and national laboratories, institutes, and universities should be developed to prioritize AI activities, taking into account synergies with international partners and communities. So again, relevant to the Genesis mission. Technology transfer, there was a recommendation. I won't speak to that. There was then a number of recommendations on project implementation. I'm not going to go through these recommendations in the interest of time, but these are more specific to the European process of how it is that they're going to manage and deal with this large project. There was a section on synergies with neighboring fields. So this is section 8. And again, let me just call out one of the recommendations over here that says that the European particle physics community, in coordination with APEC, that's the astrophysics organization, and NUPEC, which is the nuclear physics organization, should maintain its scientific diversity via strong collaboration with nuclear and astroparticle laboratories and research infrastructures in Europe and beyond, including the Einstein telescope. And then part of the reason for my highlighting this and the electron ion collider in the US. So again, directly referencing important things for the US. Sustainability, environmental impact are certainly important, but again, a bit more local in that sense. Then there's a number of recommendations on public engagement uh, and education and so forth. Again, these are many kinds of things that we're actually doing also in the US, so I won't go through those. And I just end with the 110E, which notes the particle physics community should continue its unwavering commitment to place the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, at the heart of its activities. So let me conclude. The European Strategy Group, the ESG, provided its recommendations to the CERN Council for the FCCEE as the next flagship project for CERN. I noted that there was overwhelming European support as well as strong support by the US for this plan. There are more materials to come in support of the recommendations, so I urge some patience if you're not satisfied with seeing what the justifications were in the recommendation document. More of it will become public by the end of January of this year, particularly the report of Working Group 2B to provide the physics assessment for the various accelerator options. And then going to the future, the CERN Council plans to update the European Strategy for Particle Physics, ESPP 26, based on these ESG inputs and recommendations by May of 2026. That's with an initial deliberations in March of 2026. At this point, they would upgrade the strategy. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Mike. We have a few questions that came in from Jordan Stark. Outside of CERN's recent 860 million Swiss franc announcement, are there any public-private partnerships being explored to get additional support?
Yeah, there's an exploration. I think Tor mentioned this for the moonshot European one, where I think the scale being talked about is like 3 billion euros. There is also, I don't know if DOE is on or Abid, whether they want to say something, but certainly there was discussions of support from non-member states and what that size of a contribution, of course, is unknown yet for the US, and presumably on the scale of 2026, there'll be some committees put forward by DOE or established by DOE to try and understand that better. Again, I shouldn't speak for DOE, so if they're here, they could pipe up. So those are the ones, and then the one that Tor just mentioned, the billion, essentially private funding that just announced.
Thank you. Then there's a question from Vaya. For LEP3, at what cost could the, quote, no top quark run, quote, be repairable? I notice this is one of the areas where potential downgrading of FCCEE is considered.
Yeah, I don't have the breakdown in front of me of those three elements, right? The descoping part included not running that top run, which I think was planned to be in the first maybe 10 years of the running. So I don't have what that cost savings would be. I don't know if someone else who's on may know that better.
Okay. From Marcel Demarteau, what process is being foreseen to evaluate the physics reach of the descoped FCC on such an accelerated timescale, aiming at having it completed for the deliberation document by the end of January to ensure it is at the same level as the original input?
Yeah, I think there's work being done on that. As you're alluding to, it was not one of the options going in from the inputs that were provided. But there is work trying to to fully understand what the impacts are, what the physics impacts and capabilities are. So again, I think we hope to see that out of the working group 2B.
And a question from Graham Wilson. Is there a recommended way to express reservations about some of the recommendations and their justifications?
I don't know of a formal process. I suppose if you have, well, depends where you are, you can try and address it through the council. You could, I mean, ESG is still meeting, but in some sense that time is over and the recommendations are out. I know that some groups have published responses to recommendations in a public way, and I suppose that's one way to do it. I don't know of a formal process. And that's, of course, the deliberations that the council is charged with making and looking at all those what has come in from ESG and then making their decisions.
Are there other questions or comments for Mike? I don't see any, so thank you very much, Mike, for your overview talk.